File 12 of A Treatise of Human Nature by David Hume, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by George Yeager. Book 1, Part 2, Section 3, of the other qualities of our idea of space and time. No discovery could have been made more happily for deciding all controversies concerning ideas than that above mentioned, that impressions always take the precedency of them, and that every idea with which the imagination is furnished first makes its appearance in a correspondent impression. These latter perceptions are all so clear and evident that they admit of no controversy, though many of our ideas are so obscure that it is almost impossible even for the mind which forms them to tell exactly their nature and composition. Let us apply this principle in order to discover farther the nature of our ideas of space and time. Upon opening my eyes and turning them to the surrounding objects, I perceive many visible bodies, and upon shutting them again and considering the distance betwixt these bodies, I acquire the idea of extension. As every idea is derived from some impression which is exactly similar to it, the impressions similar to this idea of extension must either be some sensations derived from the sight or some internal impressions arising from these sensations. Our internal impressions are our passions, emotions, desires, and aversions, none of which, I believe, will ever be asserted to be the model from which the idea of space is derived. There remains, therefore, nothing but the senses which can convey to us this original impression. Now, what impression do our senses here convey to us? This is the principal question, and decides without appeal concerning the nature of the idea. The table before me is alone sufficient by its view to give me the idea of extension. This idea, then, is borrowed from and represents some impression which this moment appears to the senses. But my senses convey to me only the impressions of colored points disposed in a certain manner. If the eye is sensible of anything farther, I desire it may be pointed out to me. But if it be impossible to shew anything farther, we may conclude with certainty that the idea of extension is nothing but a copy of these colored points and of the manner of their appearance. Suppose that in the extended object or composition of colored points from which we first received the idea of extension, the points were of a purple color. It follows that in every repetition of that idea, we would not only place the points in the same order with respect to each other, but also bestow on them that precise color with which alone we are acquainted. But afterwards, having experience of the other colors of violet, green, red, white, black, and of all the different compositions of these, and finding a resemblance in the disposition of colored points of which they are composed, we omit the peculiarities of color as far as possible, and found an abstract idea merely on that disposition of points or manner of appearance in which they agree. Nay, even when the resemblance is carried beyond the objects of one sense and the impressions of touch are found to be similar to those of sight in the disposition of their parts, this does not hinder the abstract idea from representing both upon account of their resemblance. All abstract ideas are really nothing but particular ones, considered in a certain light. But being annexed to general terms, they are able to represent a vast variety and to comprehend objects which, as they are alike in some particulars, are in others vastly wide of each other. The idea of time being derived from the succession of our perceptions of every kind, ideas as well as impressions, and impressions of reflection as well as of sensations, will afford us an instance of an abstract idea.
Maybe he's going into discussing time now rather than space. Um, I am uncertain exactly what he's trying to say, but I have a notion that he's trying to get down to sort of, okay, if I have this color and there's sort of spatiality and there's sort of a color next to that, a color next to that, sort of in a sort of slow building, there's some notion that he has that it's built from the inside, that colors are built, they are added to the picture from my mind, from the inside, so to say, without going into an inside-outside dichotomy yet, because I don't think he has, I will let him present that when time comes. But he's talking about objects, he's talking about Paris, he's talking about New Jerusalem and whatever, right? So there are ideas and references to something that would normally be considered an outside, unless he thinks that New Jerusalem lives inside his mind, right? In this sort of weird solipsist manner, I don't think so. So he still has to, keep the suspense going, whether or not he thinks there is direct or only indirect access to an outside, right? Or whether or not he considers an outside at all, which I would find weird in this. When you are an empiricist, you are appealing to an outside in some way or another, in my opinion. So I would be very surprised if that's not the case. It's merely the extent and directness of the accessibility to whatever might be entailed in that outside, right? But I think he's trying to build from little steps and little Legos, and therefore it follows that. I think that is difficult when it comes to space and time, because in my opinion, everything you have access to is a part of your mind. It's goings on in your mind, right? The colors, the sounds, the tastes, the elephants are all aspects of your mind. When you're talking about an elephant, you are talking about something in your mind. And that means that space is also a part of your mind and time is also a part. It's an aspect of what is going on there. Whether or not it's a very strong or very weak access you have, right? One of those things that is very hard, one of the hardest things to point down is time, in my opinion, right? And space is, though it seemingly is sort of readily available, what is it actually, right? And there are a few things you can ponder about, in my opinion, and I don't know if Hume will get into something like that. But if you close one eye, right? If space was arriving from the outside, then why would you need two eyes, right? It's not like if space arrived and it's not created, you would only need one eye, in my opinion. If you close one eye, suddenly the sense of space is severely reduced, in my opinion, right? The judgment of distances and so on is hard to do. You could argue, yeah, that's because you're closing one eye and you need two eyes in order to observe space. But why would you if space arrived through the eyes? Why wouldn't you need 17 then, right? Or 3 maybe for 3 dimensions maybe, right? I don't know, but it seems unlikely to me that space is arriving through the eyes. Just if you were pondering about that question, you would only need one eye because there's one, space arrives and there it is, right? Why would you need another, channel to have the same thing arriving apparently? And therefore, only then you can create space, right? So it seems unlikely that it's the combination of these two eyes that creates space. And it has been so well honed that when you have the sense of space and you're using your arms, for instance, right? You can move your finger. If I move it close to my screen here, right, to the camera, that my idea of space and my idea of when I will receive a feeling from my finger is exactly coordinated, right? That what somebody would say, well, that proves that space is not created by the mind, because then there would be a discrepancy between what the mind creates and what the finger touches, right? That you would sometime at least be, right, off. But there you could possibly find research that find that I've heard somebody say that something that approaches you, you are likely to see it coming faster towards you than it actually is, because it's better to be early warned than being late, right? It's better to jump before the train arrives rather than saying, no, it's way down the track and there you were hit before you thought you were hit, right? So it's better to be in advance than being late, right? It's the same thing, like it's better to treat something as a saber-toothed tiger that isn't a saber-toothed tiger than treating a saber-toothed tiger as a fluffy teddy bear, right? So it's sort of this fear and entrepreneurship, right? There's so many things that could go wrong, you could say, but there's only one thing that can go right. You have an idea of what the right thing, but in that standard of that right thing that you want, there's a plethora of things that could possibly go wrong. So it seemed there's an overwhelming sort of negative shit that sort of, if you become a fear-based creature as a human being, right? Maybe I am, cycling a lot here, right? But getting back to space, I would say everything that you have access to, right, is space. Or everything you have access to is what you have access to. That you have no access to something that arrives from the outside. Whatever may arrive from an outside is not that which you experience. Saying that light is sort of a particular wave or something like that, that's a correlation, right? A wave is not red, right? That's just a representation of what that thing that arrives through your eyes are represented using those waves when they are represented as color, right? So everything you have access to is a mental representation, in my opinion, right? You cannot get around this. And it's also a good starting point. They're saying, well, if I have to start with my own impressions, right, then there might be some underlying scaffolding that the mind is already using, on which it places the colors according to the visual system, right? So when I experience something, it just slaps these. It doesn't have to measure each and every dot of color, how far away it thinks it is. The whole system of vision is thrown into a particular place depending on the combination of the two eyes and placed on this scaffolding. And it has been honed and made precise so that when you use your finger, as I did before, it matches up with that sort of expectation of space, right? Okay, so this is my sort of, I don't think that he goes this sort of deep into it, but it's these kinds of thoughts. So I don't feel I need to go deep into this kind of argumentation, but it's important to me to have the idea that he is approaching these aspects and approaching it very carefully. He's not just throwing up shit and saying, this is how it is, right?
Idea which comprehends a still greater variety than that of space, and yet is represented in the fancy by some particular individual idea of a determinate quantity and quality. As it is from the disposition of visible and tangible objects we receive the idea of space, so from the succession of ideas and impressions we form the idea of time, nor is it possible.
Okay, I would agree with Hume here, as I just stated. I don't think that we receive. I don't think I receive. It is from. It's from the disposition of visible and tangible objects we receive. This is kind of fluffy, right? It is kind of fluffy. That might be understood in one way. It might also we receive the idea. So an idea is received from an impression. So space is something that arrives from ideas. Or it's an idea that we arrive from the objects that are already ideas based on impressions. So from the succession of ideas and impressions, we form the idea of time. Okay, so it's kind of convoluted, this. I don't think he's sufficiently detailed about this. It's not particularly coherent, in my opinion. But it's not an aspect that I care too much about explaining, because, as I say, I consider this just a part of how the mind works. There's time is the most difficult one to get a grasp on. Space I have no problem with. It's just, I consider just a scaffolding where all the colors are placed, and sounds and tastes are sort of correlated with various cognitions within this scaffolding, this visual scaffolding, right? Let's hit on.
For time alone ever to make its appearance, or be taken notice of by the mind. A man in a sound sleep, or strongly occupied with one thought, is insensible of time, and according as his perceptions succeed each other with greater or less rapidity, the same duration appears longer or shorter to his imagination. It has been remarked by a great philosopher that our perceptions have certain bounds in this particular, which are fixed by the original nature and constitution of the mind, and beyond which no influence of external objects on the senses is ever able to hasten or retard our thought. If you wheel about a burning coal with rapidity, it will present to the senses an image of a circle of fire. Nor will there seem to be any interval of time betwixt its revolutions, merely because it is impossible for our perceptions to succeed each other with the same rapidity that motion may be communicated to external objects. Wherever we have no successive perceptions, we have no notion of time, even though there be a real succession in the objects. From these phenomena, as well as from many others, we may conclude that time cannot make its appearance to the mind either alone or attended with a steady, unchangeable object, but is always discovered by some perceivable succession of changeable objects. To confirm this, we may add the following argument, which to me seems perfectly decisive and convincing. It is evident that time, or duration, consists of different parts, for otherwise we could not conceive a longer or shorter duration. It is also evident that these parts are not coexistent, for that quality of the coexistence of parts belongs to extension, and is what distinguishes it from duration. Now, as time is composed of parts that are not coexistent, an unchangeable object, since it produces none but coexistent impressions, produces none that can give us the idea of time, and consequently, that idea must be derived from a succession of changeable objects, and time in its first appearance can never be severed from such a succession. Having therefore found that time in its first appearance to the mind is always conjoined with a succession of changeable objects, and that otherwise it can never fall under our notice, we must now examine whether it can be conceived without our conceiving any succession of objects, and whether it can alone form a distinct idea in the imagination. In order to know whether any objects which are joined in impression be inseparable in idea, we need only consider if they be different from each other, in which case it is plain they may be conceived apart. Everything that is different is distinguishable, and everything that is distinguishable may be separated according to the maxims above explained. If, on the contrary, they be not different, they are not distinguishable, and if they be not distinguishable, they cannot be separated. But this is precisely the case with respect to time compared with our successive perceptions. The idea of time is not derived from a particular impression mixed up with others and plainly distinguishable from them, but arises altogether from the manner in which impressions appear to the mind without making one of the number. 5 notes played on a flute give us the impression and idea of time, though time be not a 6th impression which presents itself to the hearing or any other of the senses. Nor is it a 6th impression which the mind by reflection finds in itself. These 5 sounds, making their appearance in this particular manner, excite no emotion in the mind, nor produce an affection of any kind, which, being observed by it, can give rise to a new idea. For that is necessary to produce a new idea of reflection. Nor can the mind, by revolving over 1,000 times all its ideas of sensation, ever extract from them any new original idea, unless nature has so framed its faculties that it feels some new original impression arise from such a contemplation. But here it only takes notice of the manner in which the different sounds make their appearance, and that it may afterwards consider without considering these particular sounds, but may conjoin it with any other objects. The ideas of some objects it certainly must have, nor is it possible for it without these ideas ever to arrive at any conception of time, which, since it appears not as any primary distinct impression, can plainly be nothing but different ideas or impressions or objects disposed in a certain manner, that is, succeeding each other.
Succeeding each other.
I know there
Succeeding. Okay, so I just got a few thoughts here, and this is what is interesting by reading Hume, that for me at least, we are very close to each other in the philosophy. It seems like we are basically having more or less the same starting ground, and therefore we will be agreeing on much of what follows, and we have the same kind of approach to doing philosophy, the skeptical approach, I might call it, right? You don't just bring in shit out of nowhere. It has to be based on your prior maxims, as he calls it, and so on and so on and so on. You can't just bring in shit and say, now I'm going to, now there are this, now there's this. So where did that come from? If you just describe everything as impressions and ideas, you can't just bring in a third thing when you need to, right? So you have to look back and say, okay, so how does this arrive? Am I just creating a new idea out of nowhere, right? A new simple idea out of nowhere. I can't do that because I set some boundaries for myself. And that's why this kind of structured fashion of philosophy is so important, because what you're actually limiting is yourself and your ability to come up with shit, right? And I guess that's not why people don't want to do this kind of ground floor kind of philosophy, because it limits their ability to come up with whatever they want. And it's then also less likely that they're going to fit their philosophy around an agenda, right? They're going to end up with whatever it ends up when they're doing good philosophy. So you have to use a sort of this idea of a blank, you wipe the slate clean of what you think you have in a sort of a Cartesian fashion maybe. Find the starting point and say, I'm going with that, right? And starting and fitting things onto this and so on and so on and so on in the manner that Hume does here. I'm very it's nice that at least there is at least one philosopher like Hume, which is Hume, right, out there who's actually attempted to do this, creating a treatise, as he says, right? This is sort of a ground floor, and then I'm built from that. He points to that if I'm trying to search myself, how do I get to an idea of time? And the first question might be, well, is time arriving to me? He rejects that. Is it something about the ideas? No, there's nothing particular about the ideas that says time, because ideas have to be related to some kind of impression that might be based on some kind of sensation, which might be color, sound, taste, and so on. So he rules out the possibility that time is arriving from any kind of impression and idea. What he says is it's an ordering of the events, that how we structure our memory of events and the sort of distance between these events. And this completely in conformity with how I think of time, right? At least, maybe I'm putting my own philosophy into this. That might be the case to some extent. So I'm sorry for that if I'm pressing something onto Hume here, right? But it very much sounds like that to me.
There are some who pretend that the idea of duration is applicable in a proper sense to objects which are perfectly unchangeable. And this I take to be the common opinion of philosophers as well as of the vulgar. But to be convinced of its falsehood, we need but reflect on the foregoing conclusion, that the idea of duration is always derived from a succession of changeable objects and can never be conveyed to the mind by anything steadfast and unchangeable. For it inevitably follows from thence that since the idea of duration cannot be derived from such an object, it can never in any propriety or exactness be applied to it, nor can anything unchangeable be ever said to have duration. Ideas always represent objects or impressions from which they are derived, and can never, without a fiction, represent or be applied to any other. By what fiction we apply the idea of time, even to what is unchangeable, and suppose, as is common, that duration is a measure of rest as well as of motion, we shall consider in section 5 after.
No, but when you are at rest or at your emotion, in emotion, it's one way to see it is that when you have a visual field, you could say, you have that impression, or a large part of the impression is the visual field, let's say. Things are composed in a certain way, and if the composition was always the same, there would be no idea of time. Why would you need time? It's because things change, and in the fashion they change, that idea of time has a function, because time is used to predict something between the sort of the stretching between events, right? In a sense, if you look at if you want an apple, let's say, right? There's an apple tree next to you, and on that hill over there, 1,000 yards away, and on top of the hill, there's also an apple tree with a nice big juicy red apple, as there is here, the same kind of red juicy apple. Now, an idea of time helps you further your livelihood in the most beneficial manner, so that you say, how much time do I need to get to that apple compared to that apple? Your expectation of time helps you to avoid unnecessary, unwanted events between you not having the apple and you having the apple, right? The more time you have to spend, it's more likely that something is going to happen that makes you unable to get the apple. So the more events you can squeeze between you not having the apple and having the apple of your expectations, the less likely it is you're going to get the apple. So therefore, if you can remove the likelihood of getting annoying events between you and the apple, then you should get the closest apple, or which you consider to be the closest in time to get the apple. I'm not saying what time is here, but it's about events between you and another particular event that you want, right? So it's a part of rationalization that time becomes a measure stick for success in some way or another, right? And success is also a subjective term, right? Well, what doesn't mean that it's successful? Well, that's up to me, right? What is success for one person doesn't necessarily make it a success for another person. If I get through deconstructing Hume's treatise here, right? That would be a success for me. Some other person might say it's a complete waste of my time. Right? Waste of my time. It's a waste of my time. So it's I have fabulated about my idea of time in a recent video, I think, and you can please go on and check that out, and it conforms a bit to what I just stated here, right? But I think that in his sort of slightly convoluted polemic manner, he is describing basically how I think about time, I would suspect, right? It's just that it seems a bit like he's still on that borderline between when is it arriving and when is it sort of, is an impression a part of the mind, is an idea a part of the mind, is time in the impressions and in the ideas and so on. It's sort of, it's still kind of fluffy, this boundary between the inside and a potential outside, right?
Afterwards. There is another very decisive argument which establishes the present doctrine concerning our ideas of space and time, and is founded only on that simple principle that our ideas of them are compounded of parts which are indivisible. This argument may be worth examining.
I just thought that the idea of a clock is actually to create steady events, so that you can predict very precisely when there have been 2,000 clock events we are going to meet. And if we have the same clock, we will meet at the same time, right? Potentially. So it's rather than saying when the sun is whatever, right? We will meet. So a clock is more precise. It says tuk, 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 tuk. It creates events where there are none, but the events are even spread out in a expected manner, that sort of the distance between each event is the same, without explaining exactly what that distance is, because it's a mental thing that I can't get to, which is actually time, in a sense, right? The expansion of time or whatever. I'm careful not to use. And this is also how to describe time. You can only use some kind of space. And maybe that's why space and time are always lumped together, and also in Einsteinian physics, right? And I actually, come to think of it, I fabulated in my last part about whether or not Einstein was inspired by Hume, and apparently it seems that Einstein had read Hume in his young days when he was in Switzerland, right? And he was there was sort of science club or a some kind of a student club where they were reading various texts, and one of those texts that he was very fond of was Hume's treatise, and particularly this part about space and time, which has always been some kind of mantra of Einstein that he had been grappling with since his childhood, right? So yeah, let's head into it.
Idea that is distinguishable, being also separable, let us take one of those simple indivisible ideas of which the compound one of extension is formed, and separating it from all others and considering it apart, let us form a judgment of its nature and qualities. It is plain it is not the idea of extension, for the idea of extension consists of parts, and this idea, according to the supposition, is perfectly simple and indivisible. Is it therefore nothing? That is absolutely impossible. For as the compound idea of extension, which is real, is composed of such ideas, were these so many non-entities, there would be a real existence composed of non-entities, which is absurd. Here, therefore, I must ask, what is our idea of a simple and indivisible point? No wonder if my answer appears somewhat new, since the question itself has scarce ever yet been thought of. We are wont to dispute concerning the nature of mathematical points, but seldom concerning the nature of their ideas. The idea of space is conveyed to the mind by two senses, the sight and touch.
Okay, so I'm reminded of that's why he mentioned in his first part about ideas and impressions that, and I might, when I get to it, I have to mark this one up. That he was talking about ideas except those of space and touch, sight and touch. And this is why, because these are responsible for space, according to him, I think, right? Okay, let's head in. This is interesting.
Nor does anything ever appear extended that is not either visible or tangible. That compound impression, which represents extension, consists of several lesser impressions that are indivisible to the eye or feeling, and may be called impressions of atoms or corpuscles in.
I'm sorry, Hume, to break in here, but it's sort of fresh in my mind. At what point does space arrive among your impressions, so to say, or in your sensations, or the building of your sensations into an experience of some kind, a presentation of some kind, right? He's not particularly clear about this, I would say. But maybe I'm just being a little ahead of him here, right? So I'm sorry for that. But is it arriving from the outside? Obviously not, because then you would need a sixth sense, because the color doesn't come with space. Color is just color, right? So is it the eye that creates it? Why? How would it? The eye is just hit by something, apparently, right? To the best of whatever, you can't even know what is actually going on there, because the eye is a mental representation within that experience that I'm referring to, right? So I can't use the experience itself to explain the experience, right? So I have to step back and say I can't use any part of the experience to explain why the experience is the way it is. That would be circular. So the only way to come up with this, in my opinion, is to say space is already a part of mind. And that's why it can go so fast. I just swing my eye and there space is, it's like it's there. It's not like the mind has to adjust itself, the eye has to adjust very, very shortly, at least, extremely shortly, right? It's a fraction of a second, if anything, right? And there it is. I switch my eyes still, same space, same. There's nothing. There's no adjusting or focusing or anything. It's just there. That makes me say space. There's sort of a scaffold of space in your mind, and then whatever arrives through your sight, maybe touch, but we'll deal with that with Hume here, right? Sight is just thrown up on the walls using the two eyes as the reference of where in this scaffolding does this color needs to be placed. That makes the visual apparatus less, let's say, encumbered by spending a lot of energy trying to build something that might not be useful, right? So it's sort of it's that I don't know. Maybe I'm also fabulating a bit beyond what I can actually fabulate about, right? But it's and it takes away a bit of discussion on what about space and so on, right? And I don't think that space and time necessarily needs to be lumped together. Only in the sense that when we have an experience of a situation, a kind of change, and we have a remembrance of that situation is kept as sort of a snapshot, you could say. It's more complicated than, a usual term of a snapshot. And then later another situation, and then a new snapshot placed in front of the old snapshot, and so on in perpetuity until, the end of your days, right? And the distance in the mind, and however the mind quantifies this, the mental quantification of time, however it does, is the sort of mental distance between these particular events in your memory. That has nothing to do with space, right? Do you remember space when you are remembering whatever, right? Is it more like a two-dimensional picture rather than a three-dimensional picture in your memory? I'm not quite clear on that, right? So it seems that space is not used necessarily in memories. So space is used for you to navigate, but when you don't need to navigate, you don't need to navigate inside a memory. You no longer need space in that memory, right? So memory might just be some kind of let's say two-dimensional snapshot, which is enough for you to have sort of an idea of what went on there, right? And any idea of time or space are some added attributes to that memory, so that you have sort of a reference of the quality of that memory. But it's the distance in the mind between the memory that is time, right? And if there's nothing happening in your life, you seem that your life is boring because there's so much time between events. And, when you're sitting and waiting for if you miss the train and the next train is in 20 minutes and you have to get to the train, you have to sit there and wait for 20 minutes. And nothing important happens to you in those 20 minutes. That's why it takes so long for you it feels so long to wait for these extra 20 minutes, because you're reminded constantly you should be sitting on the train doing something that is more beneficial to you than sitting here waiting for the next train. That is only reminding you that you are 20 minutes late, right?
Endowed with color and solidity. But this is not all. It is not only requisite that these atoms should be colored or tangible in order to discover themselves to our senses, it is also necessary we should preserve the idea of their color or tangibility in order to comprehend them by our imagination. There is nothing but the idea of their color or tangibility which can render them conceivable by the mind. Upon the removal of the ideas of these sensible qualities, they are utterly annihilated to the thought or imagination. Now, such as the parts are, such is the whole. If a point be not considered as colored or tangible, it can convey to us no idea, and consequently the idea of extension, which is composed of the ideas of these points, can never possibly exist. But if the idea of extension
No, but it's sort of Euclid and the elements and so on, right? If you, I have actually the fancy, yeah, I think it's actually a Scotsman who made a graphical drawing of Euclid's elements, or a significant part of the elements, that where you can see the most important parts of the elements, so on. That this the starting point is actually this starting point, right? Is that a point is that which has no extension. So if it has no extension, it doesn't matter how many points you add, it still has no extension, right? So they can't exist if it has no extension. It's obvious, right? And that's also what he points out here. He's implicitly pointing to Euclid's elements, I would say, right? And but it's all in mathematics and geometry. It's all a mental construct, right? That is useful. It works. It doesn't matter if you can experience it. You can attach it to reality after that calculation, and it works. And that's the point of it. It's not whether or not it's an actual representation of whatever you call nature, right? So, and it works because what you are mapping this geometry or whatever mathematical shit to is also a mental representation. That's why they're compatible. Because one is derived from the other. Mathematics is derived from those impressions and ideas. And when you do the mathematics that go the other way and say, I'm going to build a bridge, you are using something that is a derivative of impression ideas in order to conform particular new expected ideas and impressions. So it works together this way, all because it's all going on in the mind, right?
really can exist, as we are conscious it does, its parts must also exist, and in order to that, must be considered as colored or tangible. We have therefore no idea of space or extension but when we regard it as an object either of our sight or feeling. The same reasoning will prove that the indivisible moments of time must be filled with some real object or existence whose succession forms the duration and makes it conceivable by the mind.
No, the mind is not conceiving of it. The mind is creating time and placing it. But let's, I don't want to enforce my philosophy on Hume necessarily, right? I'm just, it's very quickly that you can switch between what we're talking about here, right? Okay, I was just thinking a little thought experiment that I may put a marker here to say that this is how far we came. Maybe I should do it on the next page. Here. This is how far we came. And if we go to the, maybe that's a stupid idea. We can handle this without. Well, why am I screwing around? The idea of the first. Sorry, I'm a little preoccupied here. Sorry about that. Thinking about. We were dealing in the first part. We were dealing with ideas and impressions and how to approach that, how to classify that, and so on. Now we're talking about time and space. Is it an obvious next step to talk about time and space after ideas and impressions, or should it be the other way around? Maybe. And I mean, is that the logical next step? If you can lose logic in this sense here, right? Then when he has got to the ideas of impressions, or got to the philosophy of impressions and ideas, shouldn't time and space be a part of impression and ideas? Or is he sort of stepping outside of what he calls perception and talking about ideas in space, separate from the, so they say, okay, now this is done. Now I'm going to talk about this, and then in some next coming section, I'm going to combine ideas and impressions with time and space. I would think it's the latter, but it's this. I'm not particularly superbly fond of the idea of, okay, I'm going to introduce this, now I'm going to introduce that, and then I'm going to introduce the other, and in a fourth bit, I'm going to combine all these three things. I like it to be a step at a time in real time kind of philosophy where one thing leads to the next in a way that is where I don't have to try and connect whether or not are these actually well-founded things that should be connected in some way or another. Just because he does it this way is not necessarily, what you have. I am deconstructing it, so I can only deconstruct the philosophy he has created or written. I can't deconstruct something that potentially could be missing in here, right? So is he leaving something out that I'm not aware of? And if that notion or that, criticism or fear of there's something that is left out that I'm not aware of because I'm not aware of it because it's left out. That if you're building from a very strong foundation and always keeps this grand view, right? That you are never dealing with anything that is, okay, now I'm going to talk about something that is disconnected from it, and then I'm combining it afterwards. That could point to a weakness in the philosophy and potential sophistry. Now, I'm not one to call Hume a sophist, on the contrary, but it might be what would that incidental sophistry, right? It's sort of making a virtue of a necessity or something like that, right? So I'm not necessarily criticizing. I'm fine with basically so far. I don't have any reason to be critical of his structure here, but I am sort of a little concerned about the way why he does it, right? It's just my built-in skepticism that there's nothing about impressions and ideas that says, okay, therefore I need to start to talk about space and time, right? And if the impressions are already, as I say, might be placed in space, then space should be a part of the impressions, maybe, right? Or at least a discussion of the impressions and where to place space. And why is space and time lumped together? I don't think they necessarily should be, right? There might be some interconnection on a deeper level somewhere, right? They are connected somehow, but they're not sort of space and time and then everything, I think they should be placed apart. Space and time shouldn't be used together. Another way to think of this is that if you can show me any kind of physical formula or any kind of physical in physics, right? Relativity or Newtonian or any where only space and time occurs. Any formula where only space and time occurs, let me know, please. I've asked around, nobody seems. They can also, but what about speed, which is sort of distance divided by time, right? Space and time. Yeah, but there's also speed, right? And speed is a definition. It's a created definition. I would like to have a number, a quantification of the relative, what's it called, the ratio between distance and time, in order to get a number that gives me an idea of how fast I'm moving. But that's not a part of that. That's just artificially created. It's an artificial where somebody says, I'm going to take space and time and create a new number I call speed. Well, speed is a third kind, right? And I don't want a third kind. I only want two, space and time, and nothing else. If you can give me that, then I might be able to say that time and space is a part of the impressions. And if not, I will never get to a point where I can say it's part of my impressions. Okay, see you in the next one.